Hi, and welcome to Community First Open Source and Action Plan. My name is Pavithra, and I work as a developer advocate at Quansight, and today I'm representing a project called Nibari, and I'll get to why that's relevant in a second. My co-presenter for this talk is Tania Allard, co-director at Quansight Labs and a Nibari maintainer. So she championed a lot of the work that I'll be discussing in this talk, and she's also present at the conference in person for the Q&A session. All right, so let's get started. What is community first open source? Like, what does the title slide mean? So, at least for the scope of this presentation, we can classify broadly open source projects into company backed and community driven. So, company backed projects will be projects that are created and maintained by one company or maybe a handful of companies, right? They are the primary stakeholders, and an example could be PyTorch before joined the Linux Foundation. On the other hand, community-driven projects are driven, developed, and governed by the community as a whole, and a single company or maybe a handful of companies, they're just part of the broader community around a project. So by community, like this broader community consists of enthusiasts, users, contributors, sustainers, just everyone who interacts with the projects, right? It can be members of the upstream and downstream project communities as well. So this is the wide, broad ocean, and a single company entity, even if it's a handful of folks, they are just a part of this broader ecosystem. Now, both of these models have their advantages, right? Company-backed projects can have really fast iteration cycles and dedicated resources. And on the other hand, community-driven projects can be considered an approach to long-term sustainability because of, open decisions, improvements that benefit a lot of different people, and investment in just onboarding new contributors and sustainers to the project. So both have their advantages, but this talk focuses on moving from company-backed to community-driven or community-first models. So you can do this for any reason. The Nibari project did it for long-term sustainability, and we're actually in the process of this transition. And we've gone through the initial stages and laid some foundations. And this talk is capturing the lessons we learned, the approaches we took, just structuring it in a way to just create a path so that others in a similar boat don't have to start from scratch, right? So that's the idea here. All right, so what is the first step? Guiding principles. So moving or like transitioning to a different model, right, is a milestone for the project. It's a chance, an opportunity to just reevaluate a few things. And one of those things are guiding principles. So these are it can be step 0 actually. So by guiding principles, I mean user personas and journeys. Let's start here because at the end of the day, an open source project is created for some users. And we want to make sure that this user community is the same, or is it changing? Just think about what this user community will look like as your project transitions from company backed to community first, right? So it can be as detailed or not as detailed as you want. So here's an example from our personas discussion. On the left, you see a few different personas. We have machine learning engineer, data scientist, and on the right, just thinking about what this person's story looks like, what tools do they need to do their day-to-day job, what are their pain points, what are their core needs, and does our project, as it is going to move into a community-driven framework, does it still work for them, right? So that is the idea here. Next thing we want to discuss and align on with your entire team are core values. These become especially important because these will set the direction of the future of your project at this milestone. So here are some examples from Nibari. Accessibility and inclusion was one of the core values. Explicit documentation, making sure there are higher standards of security. So these are just, once you've discussed this with your team, all of us are on the same page. So we can just move from here, like take this direction, and this will feed into just things we need to do next. And a good way to just represent both core values and user personas is with a vision board. So everything you've discussed, it can be just general informal discussions, right? But a vision board is just it's a tool to condense that information into like a one pager that you can access at any time. Right, and there are different frameworks for creating a vision board, whatever works for you. This is just Nibari's example. Now, with the guiding principles done, so this is like the very base layer. Once we've evaluated that, you can now build on it. Like that's given you a direction, now we can just expand on it, right? So project management is the actual things that this is where you get your hands dirty with these things. So license, code of conduct, repository management, communication channels, governance, and messaging and branding. We'll go through these one by one. There, licensing. So licenses are one of the most important parts of open source software, right? And your project may already have some form of license, but it's just useful to think about, is it going to change? Like with your new core values and your vision. And it's not just about your project now, but also just projects you plan to interact with, supporting projects, upstream, downstream projects, maybe future collaborations, like what kind of licenses do you expect them to have? What kind of licenses would they expect you to have, right? This is just a few things to ponder on and decide on, right? Next is code of conduct, equally if not more important for an open source project. So again, you may have a policy already, or you may be using like a company policy, right? So does it still hold true as you transition into a community-driven approach, or do you want to create a new one? And what will the enforcement strategy look like for that policy? Here are a few resources, policies that we found interesting and worth mentioning during our research for Nibari. And for Nibari, we actually we adopted the Turing Way's code of conduct with SciPy's diversity statement because they aligned with our core values of being explicit and inclusion and accessibility. Next is repository management. So this is just planning where your project lives. GitHub, GitLab, it probably already is hosted somewhere, right? And what will your team structure look like? How will you give permissions to people who has write access? All of that fun stuff. And also labels and templates, like with this move, like how will your issue templates change, for instance? Like you need to add more context to things, right? So do you need more labels to add more context? So thinking about these management things. This is an example of Nibari. So for Nibari, we actually created a new organization. It used to be called QHub under the Quansight umbrella. So this is a separate organization, and we also split the repository. Like the documentation now has a separate repo from the code repo, right? And we have this .github repo where we just have all the project health documents, like the issue template here, and these files are synced across all the other repositories with a GitHub action. So this is our example. So this is what we mean by management, repository management, right? All of these things. And next, communication channels. So this is important in a community-driven approach. Like where will your core team, which I'm hoping they're going to continue contributing to the project, right? How do you open to new folks? So we need open public support channels. Development chat needs to be in a different place, probably GitHub issues, right? And meeting notes, if you need to have synchronous meetings, how frequently do they need to be? Where will you host the notes, docs? Who will organize these meetings, I suppose? So just thinking about what communication looks like in this new approach. Governance. Governance is crucial when it comes to when we think about this transition, because this is where the most change will happen typically, right? Because how you make decisions is going to change. You may have had one or two folks, or like it's sometimes decisions are ad hoc, but with a community driven approach, we need an explicit mechanism, with context, just so that everything is documented, like how decisions were made and why they were made. And this can typically look like an RFD process with some sort of voting mechanism. In small teams, it can be like, a unanimous vote or something like that. So after governance, lastly, messaging and branding. This is a little bit of, it's just fun, creative things. Does your project's brand and mission align with the new values and vision that you created? Like, that's the question we're asking, and it can depend on your project, right? For Nabari, we basically did a complete overhaul. Everything. The name of the project changed. Colors, logo, just everything pretty much. It was a complete rebrand. And there was a reason for it, because the old brand did not align with the new values and the direction we wanted the project to go in. So that's what we want to be thinking about here. Now, once we have these foundational project management bits complete, the next and final step is enabling contributions. And this becomes especially important because if your project was company backed, there people have worked on it before, and you may have some historical information, decisions that new folks will not be aware of, but they may need to be effective contributors. So this involves pathways and guidelines for contributors and maintainers, architecture information, and a roadmap. Quickly getting into these one by one, we have guidelines for not only code, but also just low and no code contributions, because open source contributions go above and beyond development. We may have folks interested in documentation, marketing, design, administrative tasks. So if you can support them, it'll be nice to create some paths and guidelines for them. And an example here is just documenting best practices for filing issues and PRs. So this not only helps new folks, but also reminds existing developers to, add more context to their PRs. Maintainer guidelines is similar vein, just creating a path for folks to move from contributors to maintainers. And a few things here can be having guidelines for code reviews. Again, not only helps new folks, but also existing folks, right? And documenting your testing and debugging workflows if they weren't already stated explicitly somewhere. And here's the Nibari example. This is a work in progress, but just to give you a sense of what your what these guidelines can look like. Next is architecture information. Again, these are just things that may not have been documented before, making sure the internal architecture is shared somewhere for new folks to learn. And the release mechanism. This is something you may also want to discuss with your team, like what the release process will look like moving forward, right? And lastly, a roadmap to just give everyone a sense of what is important for the project, what's next, what are you planning to do. So you may want to make sure your documentation is flexible enough to incorporate all of these new things that now need to be documented. For Nabari, we ended up overhauling pretty much the entire documentation and selected the Diet Access framework, which proved to be quite flexible. We also created a new style guide. And the thing to just note here is make sure you're addressing all of these community members, like the broader community that we talked about earlier, just making sure your documentation now addresses everybody. And lastly, these will all evolve as your community grows, and you can expect that. So just for us, it's just been being open to feedback and then just regularly reviewing a few of these things. with that, I will say thank you and open for questions.